Hello everyone, welcome to another Electionism video, the channel where we cover politics from around the world, both foreign and domestic. Welcome to the second ever election primer in this series, after a brief 3-month hiatus. Some personal stuff got in the way, but I am happy to pick up right where I left off. So today I will cover our second ever foreign election, this time in Hungary. For those that do not know, Hungary will be holding its national election on the 16th of April, 2026. Hungary's election is a really important one to watch because it is a test of the rule of Viktor Orbán, perhaps one of the most famous or infamous European leaders within the EU. Orbán was one of the first in this new generation of far-right populist politicians to come to power and has been able to consolidate his power in Hungary in a way that the far-right around Europe, in other places, has been unable to do. His rule has been riddled with accusations of corruption, cronyism, disdain for the rule of law, authoritarian crackdowns, and open bigotry. But other far-right politicians around Europe, the world, and even in the United States cite his rule over Hungary as a key example to be followed and replicated as part of their playbook. Orbán will face a challenge from former ally-turned-enemy Peter Magyar, who, for reasons that will become clear, is unlike any other opposition leader that has come before him. He has been able to capture the attention and imagination of Hungarians across the political spectrum, including former Orbán voters, but has also been the victim of a vicious defamation campaign by the Hungarian government. The polls are tight, and while the ball seems to be more in Magyar's court at the moment, it is still anyone's election. Hungarian voters will make their choice on April 16th, 2026. So, as always, before we actually get into who is actually running for the office and who is actually contesting this election and what political parties exist in Hungary's political landscape, we first need to talk about how the Hungarian system works. So, Hungary uses a parliamentary system of government, meaning that the chief of state and most powerful politician in the country is the prime minister. As with most other parliamentary systems, the prime minister is determined by the composition of Hungary's parliament after a national election and is the leader of the largest party or coalition in the National Assembly. Customarily, the Prime Minister is usually also himself a member of Parliament. The Hungarian Parliament has a single chamber, which is called the National Assembly, which has 199 seats. Hungary uses a mixed-member proportional representation system, or, as it is sometimes also known, a mixed-member majoritarian representation system, which differs slightly from other electoral systems we've covered, such as that of Slovenia's. 106 of these 190 seats are elected via first-past-the-post voting in single-member districts, the same way that they would be elected in the United Kingdom or the United States. Each of the 106 seats corresponds to a specific geographic area, with each one having roughly the same population. Within that district, an election is then held to elect the representative of that district to the National Assembly, and the candidate that gets the most votes is sent to Parliament. This is called first-past-the-post, same way that we elect the House of Representatives here in the United States or the House of Commons in the United Kingdom or Canada. Same principle. The other 93 seats, however, the other 93 out of the total of 199, are elected in a different way, specifically by proportional representation from around the country. Hungary uses proportional representation from within a single constituency, which is all registered voters, and parties receive a certain percentage of these 93 seats depending on how much of the popular vote they received. Parties must receive over 5% of the vote to qualify for proportional representation, and the D'Hondt method is used to dole out these seats. This means that if you are a Hungarian voter, when you go to the polling booth, you will see a ballot with essentially two separate votes on it for the National Assembly. The first vote is, of course, for who should be your district representative, and the second vote is for a political party to contribute to their proportional representation. So this allows you to, split your ticket between who is most likely to win in your constituency and maybe who you sort of align with on a more ideological level, right? So if there's, let's say maybe I'm like a Green Party voter, but, the Green Party obviously isn't going to win in my district, then I can vote for, the candidate that is likely to win that I most align with, and then vote for the Green Party in the proportional list, and this lets me both express my true opinion, but also vote pragmatically in my district for someone who could actually win without wasting my vote. So that's kind of the rationale for that system. Following the election, Hungary's parliament then meets and the business of forming a government begins. If one party got a majority of the seats, which can and very often does happen in Hungary's system, then coalition talks end there, and the leader of that party is appointed as the prime minister. However, if no party gets the 100 seats necessary for a majority, then 2 or more parties must form a coalition government. This has happened several times before, but under Orban, of course, this has become increasingly rare. Once a prime minister becomes apparent, the president, which is an entirely ceremonial position who does not take an active role in politics, formally appoints the prime minister, who is then confirmed by a vote of parliament, and then the prime minister's term begins. The prime minister then gets to appoint the entire cabinet and use their parliamentary majority to direct government policy and pass legislation until the next election comes around in 4 years. That's the term of a prime minister, 4 years, assuming no vote of no confidence is called. As with most parliamentary states, Hungary's prime minister can be removed from office via a vote of no confidence, but this is noticeably different from some other parliamentary countries insofar as Hungary uses a constructive no vote of confidence. This means that when the no confidence motion is presented to parliament by whoever may be raising it, the opposition needs to come up with a counter candidate to the prime minister in the form of some other member of parliament. So this way, when they are submitting the vote of no confidence, they have to have a replacement successor in mind in parliament to succeed the prime minister. This is different from some other parliamentary countries where, like in the United Kingdom, if there is a vote of no confidence, that triggers an election, which, reshuffles everything. This is not the case in Hungary. You do not hold fresh elections if a vote of no confidence passes. You simply get whoever was slated to replace the prime minister in the vote of no confidence motion. So, of course, with that out of the way, we can now talk about the candidates and who is actually running to become Hungary's prime minister or next prime minister. The main candidate, of course, that everyone is talking about is Viktor Orban, the longtime far-right strongman that has ruled the country for more than a decade and is the godfather of the European sort of far-right, right-wing populist political system in Europe. There are so many things that I could say about Viktor Orban, and so much scholarship has gone into studying his rule, his subversion of Hungarian democracy, his governing style, his ideology, and his export of his ideology abroad to places elsewhere in Europe and even in the United States. However, for the sake of time, I am going to try to keep this very brief and basic and just try to cover the key tenets of Viktor Orban's ideology. So, Viktor Orban is the head of the Fidesz party, which serves as a surrogate for his political project. He originally founded the party in the late 1980s during the waning years of the Eastern Bloc in opposition to the communist government of Hungary. He and several of his friends founded Fidesz as kind of an underground student union at their university before expanding it into a national political party in the context of nationwide anti-government protests. Orban participated in Hungary's first democratic elections in 1990 and was elected to parliament at the age of 27, a position which he has retained until this day. Over time, Orban shifted the Fidesz party further right, especially as it struggled during the early years of Hungarian democracy. He took it from this kind of liberal, progressive, student-led party to a more conservative, center-right Christian democratic party. This strategy was actually somewhat successful. He did come to power from 1998 until 2002 in a coalition with 2 smaller conservative parties. Orban, at this time, was much more of a, sort of center-right Christian Democrat, liberal conservative style politician rather than the far-right strongman that we have come to know him today. So that's kind of an important distinguishing factor between his current term and his previous 1998 until 2002 term. But it was this loss of power in 2002 that really seemed to do something to him psychologically and began his dabbling in far-right, authoritarian, and populist politics. In his years as opposition leader, he gradually began tacking harder and harder to the right, beginning to dabble in far-right politics and reinventing himself as a political outsider who stood up to the Hungarian political establishment. In 2010, the global financial crisis had given Orban all the ammunition he needed to overtake the center-left government, which was in charge of Hungary at the time, and sweep to power in a landslide election. This set him on the path to reimagining Hungary's government in his own image. Today, Fidesz is a firmly far-right political force. The party has been described as national conservative, authoritarian, right-wing populist, and even sometimes outwardly racist. Orban deeply opposes any immigration to Hungary, especially from immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa and the Islamic world. Orban has made a number of bigoted statements towards immigrants of these heritages. He has openly stated that he sees Muslim refugees from the Middle East as Muslim invaders, that all terrorists are migrants, which is not true, considering that most terrorist attacks in Europe stem from separatist movements by native Europeans. He has stated that migrants form parallel societies. He has stated that migrants are a poison to European countries that allow them to enter, and that allowing refugees to enter a country is tantamount to importing crime and terrorism. Orban has stated that a part of his motivation for not wanting to allow migrants into the country is that Hungarians are not, and I quote, a mixed race, and do not want to become, and I quote, a mixed race. He then went on to imply that countries where, quote, races mingle are no longer nations, in reference to the West. And of course, this is more than just words. Viktor Orban has backed up these statements with cruel treatment of migrants and refugees. Orban has openly announced his plan for Hungary is zero immigration whatsoever, for fear that migrants will dilute Hungary's white, ethnic Hungarian, and Christian character. Orban has made it illegal to seek asylum anywhere inside Hungary or at the border of Hungary. You have to find a Hungarian consulate in the country you are from, which for a lot of migrants is just simply impossible, and blatantly flies in the face of Hungary's obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention, to which Hungary is a signatory. Hungary has illegally refused to be a part of any EU migration quotas and has instead rejected all attempts to share the humanitarian burden of asylum seekers from the Middle East entering the EU. Orban has also been experimenting with a paramilitary force known as quote-unquote border hunters, of which there are 3,000, to hunt down asylum seekers attempting to cross into Hungary with no law enforcement experience or background. This system of essentially employing paramilitary bounty hunters to hunt down migrants is, of course, rife for abuse, which does tend to happen, and Orban has also established a series of refugee camps along the border where migrants languish in substandard living conditions and often fall incredibly ill inside. Hungary's government also violently repels refugee attempts to leave these disgusting camps and enter Hungary, and uses excessive force to do so. The Hungarian government also systemically abuses illegal migrants that it catches in its custody and bars human rights groups from speaking to them while incarcerated. Recently, the EU's top human rights court ruled that Hungary had starved a 5-year-old illegal immigrant in its custody, which is just in flagrant violation of international law. Recently, Orban has also passed a series of laws that restrict the ability of immigrant rights groups and NGOs from helping illegal migrants in the country. It criminalizes any attempt to give assistance to immigrants, defined very vaguely, of course, and imposes a prison sentence on those who do so. Furthermore, the government of Viktor Orban is also very homophobic and has expressed anti-LGBTQ attitudes. The government, of course, does not allow gay marriage and has banned it entirely, as well as banning transgender people from transitioning and legally changing their gender. The government of Viktor Orban has also banned pride parades in 2025, which actually sparked a reaction, and the largest pride parade in Europe, which the government was incapable of stopping in Budapest. But nonetheless, technically, the government has outlawed pride parades. Furthermore, the government has also banned what it calls LGBTQ propaganda in 2021. LGBTQ propaganda is defined as explicitly any depiction of an LGBTQ person or LGBTQ people in media, and the law prohibits any mention of them in Hungary's schooling or curriculum, as well as a total ban on television shows and radio media that portrays LGBTQ characters, and requires that any books that contain LGBTQ characters be sold sealed in foil such that children could not accidentally open them and look at an LGBTQ person or a mention of an LGBTQ person. As you might be able to guess, the government has done this all under the guise of protecting children, which essentially equates educating children on the existence of gay people to grooming children. Orban has also been accused of several anti-Semitic remarks due to his numerous conspiracy theories about George Soros, who is a Hungarian-American Jewish investor who has used his fortune to fund vaguely center-left think tanks in America. Viktor Orban has accused him of funding the Hungarian opposition, which is not true, in what is viewed as a vaguely anti-Semitic dog whistle. Of course, in addition to all of this, Orban and his Fidesz party do not recognize the right to abortion, believe that climate change is a hoax, have slashed taxes for the wealthiest Hungarians, and have grown a kind of oligarchic army of elites and businessmen that serve as clients and patrons for the Orban government. Orban has awarded favorable government contracts to his allies as a means of directing state funds towards their companies, and has selectively enforced media regulations in order to block out opposition media and increase the media shares of his allies and increase favorable coverage of him and his Fidesz party in the media. You get the picture. Orban is Europe's archetypical far-right, national conservative, authoritarian leader, and has used his time as Prime Minister of Hungary to convert the country into what he calls an illiberal state, basically admitting that he is done with the idea of liberal democracy and wants to entirely change the democratic process to ensure that he stays in power. I think it's also worth mentioning the KDNP real quick, the Christian Democratic People's Party of Hungary, which is a name that you might hear tossed around in various media pieces about this upcoming election. The KDNP are a satellite party of Fidesz that is currently technically in a coalition with Fidesz, but at the end of the day, the two are the same political force. The KDNP is a sort of very Christian social conservative party that works very, very closely with Fidesz. They are the same political force. I can't emphasize this enough. They are basically the same party. So if you hear the name KDNP, KDNP, that's what that is. So Viktor Orban has been doing all of this for well over a decade at this point. I mean, he's going on 2 decades. It's 17 years at this point. He has won a grand total of 4 elections, which is a lot longer than many European leaders last, and it appears as though a leadership change might be on the horizon. But who is going to challenge Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party for the role? The answer to this is Peter Magyar. Now, for those who don't know who Peter Magyar is, he actually used to be an ally of Orban, and it was his representative to the European Union for a very long time, as well as a manager of several state-owned enterprises that were connected to the Fidesz government. Magyar was also a member of Fidesz and was married to Orban's justice minister, who was also a Fidesz member. So Magyar was someone who was a longtime ally of Orban. However, Magyar's break with Orban came in spectacular style when he learned through his wife that Orban and his allies had granted a pardon to a man convicted of covering up child abuse in Hungary's orphanage system. He then secretly recorded his wife saying this and went public with it in 2024. This brought immense embarrassment upon the Viktor Orban government, especially because the Viktor Orban government has put such a big premium on quote-unquote protecting the children, which of course it uses as a dog whistle to target LGBTQ people. And what followed the break of this scandal was a massive wave of public protests across the country, including in the capital of Budapest. This began the downfall of Viktor Orban and Fidesz in public opinion polling and snowballed into a much larger scandal that Orban was unable to control effectively. Meanwhile, Magyar left Fidesz and began touring opposition media platforms and joining protests. His profile as the whistleblower who broke the scandal gradually began to grow over time as he became more and more well known to members of the opposition and became more popular among them. In mid-2024, Magyar joined a small Hungarian party called the Respect and Freedom Party, also known by its acronym TISZA, that's T-I-S-Z-A, which is the party that he now leads. The party had existed long before Magyar, but had virtually no national presence until he joined, and when he joined, of course, it boosted his popularity and put him in the national spotlight. Because Magyar could not start his own party, but wanted to run for the European Parliament, he therefore joined TISZA and kind of took it over. He quickly rose to become the party's top candidate for the EU parliamentary elections that were coming up in 2024, and came in at a very close second to Fidesz in the European parliamentary elections in Hungary, and successfully denied Fidesz a majority of the vote and a majority of the seats for Hungary in the EU Parliament. Once he secured his position in the EU Parliament, as well as the positions of 6 other TISZA members in the European Parliament, he then was formally elected as the president of the party, and due to his immense popularity was recognized as the de facto leader of the Hungarian opposition, despite the fact that he does not actually sit in Hungary's National Assembly. Now, this does not mean that Magyar is some, ultra-lefty who is going to implement all of these great reforms that are going to, completely rip apart everything that Orban has been trying to build. Magyar's choice to join TISZA was intentional because it was a smaller conservative party that opposed Orban. As leader, Magyar has molded it into a center-right, pro-Europe, liberal conservative party that is aligned with the European People's Party, which is a group of like-minded center-right parties throughout Europe. This is reflective of who Magyar is. He was, after all, a committed and ideological conservative, and TISZA's platform still sort of reflects this. While the party differs with Orban on matters such as corruption and integration into the EU, and they want to take a harder line on fraud and repair Hungary's ties with other EU member states, they still have limited agreement with Fidesz in some areas. TISZA does not have a very liberal migration policy, and still doesn't have the nicest things to say about migrants who are coming to Hungary. Furthermore, TISZA was very careful about endorsing the 2025 Pride Parade that was held in defiance of Orban's ban. Despite the fact that the Pride Parade was one of the largest in Europe and the largest single protest against Orban's rule, TISZA was very careful not to mention or endorse it until the day of. So Magyar is still a center-right, liberal conservative, pro-EU politician. He's not exactly a centrist or a lefty. Magyar versus Orban is going to be center-right versus far-right, with neither candidate really being the quote-unquote left-wing one. And to some extent, this makes sense. All of the other centrist and liberal and leftist and social democratic and green parties that have come before him have all failed to topple Orban from power. So maybe, just maybe, Magyar will be the guy to do it. So that's what this election is really about. It's really about these two guys and their respective parties. It's about Magyar versus Orban and TISZA versus Fidesz. However, there are also 2 smaller parties in the running that may play a significant role. The first one is the Our Homeland Movement Party, or MHM in its Hungarian acronym. The MHM is running to the right of Orban's Fidesz, occupying the unique political space of the further right than the far right, and its politicians more or less reflect this. MHM is a much more explicitly racist and ideologically neo-fascist party than Fidesz is. MHM insists that Viktor Orban is not doing enough to crack down on immigration or LGBTQ rights and should actively agitate with member states to secure autonomy or secession of neighboring Hungarian communities in neighboring countries. MHM is openly contemptuous of Jewish and Romani people, unlike Orban and his allies, who operate more with dog whistles than open hatred. The MHM is the closest thing to a sort of skinhead political party or a Groyper political party that Europe has. The party is also much more antagonistic towards the European Union. Unlike Orban, who kind of has this transactional relationship with the EU and tries to pursue what he views as reform in the EU, MHM actively wants to leave the EU. MHM is also actively pro-Russia and supports Russia's ambitions of territorial expansion in Ukraine. The Homeland Movement is led by a guy named Laszlo Toroczkai, who has become a significant member of the far-right hooligan scene and has been for quite some years. He has been a member of the 64 Counties Youth Movement, which is an ethnic nationalist brigade that wants to unify Hungary to its pre-1918 borders and unify all the Hungarian ethnic minorities in other countries under one flag. He was also formerly a key member and former vice president of the Jobbik Party, which was another far-right party that ran to the right of Orban. However, in 2018, Jobbik began to moderate its politics slightly, and as Hungarian politicians began to sort of solidify around the pro- or anti-Orban axis, Jobbik began to move sort of more towards the center-right opposition to Orban in order to fit in with other opposition parties from the center and left and help oppose the Orban government. As a part of this moderation process, Jobbik expelled a lot of its more extremist members, including Toroczkai. Before the 2022 elections, Toroczkai founded the Our Homeland movement and continued his crusade against the Orban government from the right, and successfully secured a seat for himself and 5 colleagues in the National Assembly. Today, the Homeland Movement is the only political party that sits apart from both Fidesz and the other opposition parties in Hungary's parliament. Toroczkai has very limited ground to operate on, since Fidesz is already a right-wing populist and very nationalist political party, but he does have limited appeal in some areas, particularly among younger people and Fidesz voters who have become disillusioned with the Orban government, and as a result is expected to get some support. The reason why I bring up the Our Homeland movement at all is not because of the fact that I think they might win, but because of the fact that if this election is really close, the Our Homeland movement could potentially serve as a kingmaker to give Orban another term. If it comes down to the fact that, neither Tisza nor Fidesz are at a majority of seats in parliament, the Our Homeland movement might be the kingmaker that could potentially grant Orban the right to stay in power for another 4 years. The other party that may make an appearance is the Democratic Coalition of Hungary. Now, the Democratic Coalition split from the Hungarian Socialist Party in 2011 due to internal disagreements about how to handle its crushing defeat at the hands of Orban in 2010. The Democratic Coalition is a largely center-left party that espouses a social democratic ideology. It's also sort of very pro-Europe and sort of third way almost. It has a lot of more socially liberal tendencies as well, and it tends to take the sort of moderate social democratic position that a lot of social democratic parties took in the 1990s. The Democratic Coalition is essentially what is left of the center-left opposition to Orban's Hungary. There are other center-left politicians in Hungary today. The Hungarian Socialist Party still exists in parliament, as does the Liberal Momentum Movement, the Green Party Párbeszéd, and others. However, almost all of them are going to be obliterated at the turn of the next election, or are choosing to sit out the next election in order to back Magyar against Orban. Except, of course, maybe the Democratic Coalition. The Democratic Coalition, once again, I only mention it because of the fact that it could be significant if neither Fidesz nor Tisza gain the requisite number of seats to form a majority government, but the Democratic Coalition makes it in. They could then sort of serve as a coalition partner to Magyar and potentially be a kingmaker in that sense. So that's the only reason I really mentioned those two parties, just because of the fact that they may wind up serving as kingmakers or coalition partners to either Magyar or Orban, depending on the turnout of the election. They could therefore be significantly influential in the future of Hungarian politics should they secure that position. I could definitely see Orban making a deal with Our Homeland movement being more likely than Magyar making a deal with the Democratic Coalition, especially because the Democratic Coalition is just so associated with the old Hungarian opposition, the old Socialist Party government that many people viewed as corrupt. So I really don't know if Magyar would want to take the political risk and make a deal with them, whereas I could totally see Orban looking to co-opt the Our Homeland movement, which, basically just says the quiet part out loud about all of his policies, and kind of try to bring them into the fold. So now that we've covered the major contenders, we get to, do a little bit of fun speculation as to what the most likely outcome is to this election, and what the polling is saying with regards to who might win. So right now, it does look like Tisza is up in the polls, and Magyar is probably going to form the next Hungarian government. Politico EU's polling aggregator certainly has Tisza above at a polling average of 51% up against Fidesz's 39%, and many electoral forecasts in Hungary are predicting a Tisza win. So in all likelihood, we are probably going to see Tisza take the victory here. We are going to see Magyar and the Tisza party win probably, a majority, not a super majority. We are probably going to see Magyar have a majority of no more than 10 seats, but we are going to see him form the next Hungarian government and become the next Hungarian prime minister, ousting Viktor Orbán from power. Now, it is important to note that you may see polling data that supports Fidesz out there. The Hungarian media is very compromised at this time. As I mentioned, a lot of Orbán's allies are the same oligarchs that own many of Hungary's major news channels, and Orbán has systematically cracked down on media that does not share his political view. So it is important to note that a lot of polls coming out of Hungary, particularly from native Hungarian news outlets, may be compromised because they are actively incentivized to release pro-Orbán polling data. So if you see that, be aware that there are pro-Orbán pollsters out there whose job it is to produce pro-Orbán polls. So just do be aware of that if you see any of those statistics. Not every statistic is going to be like that. There are certainly some polls that show Orbán winning that are conducted in an independent and fair way, but just do be aware that there are some Hungarian media outlets that are predicting, massive majorities for Orbán. That's not going to be the case. No matter who wins this election, even if Orbán does wind up winning, he isn't going to get a supermajority. He is going to probably get, a majority of no more than 10 seats. Certainly not the massive win that he got in 2010. But an Orbán loss is not at all a sure thing, and there are substantial systematic roadblocks that Orbán has placed within Hungary's electoral system during his time in power that do constitute significant roadblocks to Fidesz losing and to any opposition party winning. First of all, of course, Hungary's 106 electoral districts are very, very gerrymandered. Remember when I said that each district is supposed to have roughly the same population? Well, Orbán really extended the definition of roughly by a lot. The largest district in the country has nearly 90,000 voters, with the smallest only having 60,000, a deviation that would not be allowed in even the most ambitious gerrymanders of the United States. Of course, the larger districts are all packed into areas meant to cordon off the opposition and create pack districts. He has also used gerrymandering tactics to ensure that friendly districts outnumber unfriendly ones by using the cracking technique to split up opposition voters into a number of larger districts that contain large numbers of Fidesz voters. Furthermore, Orbán abolished the two-round system for districts. Prior to Orbán coming to power, Hungarian single-member districts would be decided in 2 rounds if nobody got more than 50% of the vote in the first round of voting. The second round would consist of the top 2 vote receivers from the first round going into a runoff against each other. However, Orbán scrapped this and instead introduced the first-past-the-post system that Hungary now has, which of course systemically benefits Fidesz against a divided opposition. Orbán also had recently removed the requirement that voters live in their district, which has prompted many Fidesz party cadres to switch their registration to districts where the election will be very close in order to swing the vote for Fidesz over the opposition in that particular district. This system has led to mass voter tourism, or a mass exodus of Fidesz voters away from safe districts and into districts where the vote will be very close, resulting in the opposition losing several seats that it otherwise should win based on the population that actually lives in that district. But district-related shenanigans are not the only kind of tomfoolery that Orbán uses in order to get ahead. Orbán has also implemented a system known as winner's compensation, making it such that the votes used to calculate the district results are then added onto the votes used to calculate the party list results based on the affiliation of the candidate that was receiving them. This boosts Orbán's numbers in the proportional list vote and allows him to gain a larger percentage of the proportional seats than he would otherwise gain. Orbán has also taken aim at the idea of tactical campaigning, when political parties choose not to compete in areas where they know that they cannot win. For example, many of Hungary's smaller parties know that they are completely uncompetitive on the district level, and in fact just serve to take away votes from the main opposition parties to Viktor Orbán. As a consequence, many of them have chosen to, withdraw candidates in areas where they are unlikely to win, and just try to stick to proportional representation. However, one of Orbán's key reforms was to demand that if parties want to receive proportional representation, they must also field a certain number of candidates at the district level. This essentially forces opposition parties to compete against each other, even when they don't want to run candidates against each other. This leads to low information but anti-Fidesz voters, or voters that are strongly supportive of one particular party, dividing the anti-Fidesz vote and allowing the Fidesz candidate to sneak through. There was always a threshold of some number of district candidates that a political party had to run if it wants to receive proportional representation. However, Viktor Orban massively increased the number of districts that these parties have to run in if they want to receive proportional representation in order to increase the amount of inter-opposition infighting. Another trick that Orban has used to get ahead is to allow Hungarians living in what are known as near-abroad areas to vote in Hungarian elections. So, for context, Hungary used to be much larger than it currently is when it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I. Hungary back then included significant portions of Ukraine, Romania, Serbia, and Croatia, as well as all of Slovakia. During this time, the government of Hungary promoted a policy of Magyarization, or moving Hungarian settlers into ethnic minority areas in order to spread Hungarian culture and prevent separatism and nationalism in those areas. When Hungary was broken up after World War I via the Treaty of Trianon for being a part of the Central Powers, this left large numbers of ethnic minorities of Hungarians stranded in these countries. Today, millions of ethnic Hungarians live in Romania, Slovakia, Croatia, Serbia, and beyond. Orban, as a part of his ultranationalist line, has granted these people the right to vote in Hungarian elections, despite the fact that many have never visited Hungary and are not governed by Hungary's rules and form their fundamentally own distinct communities. These Hungarian voters tend to be rather conservative and nationalist due to resentment of the fact that they were separated from the Hungarian motherland, as well as the fact that they were mistreated by some of the historical governments in these new countries. As a result, they all tend to vote for Orban. This is exacerbated by the fact that Fidesz often sends operatives into these countries and into these areas in order to incentivize the diaspora to vote for Orban, and by the fact that these voters can vote by mail without certification and from home. Furthermore, the voter roll for these ethnic Hungarians is not public because of the fact that many of these ethnic Hungarians live in countries where dual citizenship is prohibited, and as a result, many of these countries do not allow you to have a second passport. And of course, in order to vote in the Hungarian elections, you need to have gained citizenship, which is automatic for diaspora Hungarians, but may be illegal in their country. So the voter roll is not publicized, and as a result, we have no idea exactly how many ethnic Hungarians live in these areas and how many are voting in Hungarian elections. This is contrasted by Hungarians that live anywhere else in the world outside of Hungary, such as in the West, like Germany and the UK and the United States. Hungarians here need to go to the Hungarian consulate and must provide a much higher bar of proof to prove their citizenship in Hungary. These Hungarians tend to be much more liberal and educated and are part of Hungary's huge brain drain under Viktor Orban, which has led to many educated and upper-class Hungarians leaving the country. As a result, the Fidesz party requires a higher bar to vote for ethnic Hungarians that live in the West versus ethnic Hungarians that live in neighboring countries because of the fact that they know that Hungarians in the West are going to vote for the opposition, whereas Hungarians in neighboring countries are going to vote for Viktor Orban. But despite all these advantages, Orban might still be actually on the verge of losing for a number of reasons. First, the opposition is no longer divided. Orban's system primarily works around dividing up the opposition, forcing them to compete against each other, forcing them to, split their votes. However, opposition voters have really entirely consolidated around their support for Magyar. Regardless of whether they are moderates, progressives, liberals, social democrats, or Greens, they're mostly all planning on uniting their votes behind Magyar. Furthermore, most current opposition parties, except for the Democratic Coalition, have declared that they are not going to contest this election. The Socialist Party, the Liberal Momentum Movement, both Green parties, and even opposition conservative parties have announced that they will not be contesting this election, thus really limiting the opportunities for vote splitting here. All of these parties could choose to not sit out this election. They all have representation in the National Assembly, but because of the fact that they recognize the need to get rid of Orban, they are all uniting behind Magyar and strategically choosing to not participate in this election. If the opposition is united, it's really hard for Orban's system to take advantage of the vote splitting that it normally does. Second, there has been a fundamental shift in coalitions at work here. Magyar has a lot of broad appeal with a lot of conservative voters. He is fundamentally offering a brand of conservatism. A center-right brand, sure, but a brand of conservatism nonetheless. This makes Magyar really competitive in a lot of seats that are gerrymandered and drawn to be safe Fidesz, to be safe Orange. And this isn't because of some, change in the minds of all of these voters, but it's because of the fact that no matter who they vote for, they're still voting for a conservative. So while the gerrymander is drawn to pack together liberal voters in the city of Budapest, that's not really who Magyar and Orbán need to be worried about. They're obviously, all going to vote for Magyar. What Orbán needs to worry about is losing all of these conservatives to the other conservative, who is fundamentally not promising, any radical change in Hungary's migration policy. While there were conservative parties before that were opposed to Orbán, such as Jobbik, the fact of the matter is that all of these conservative parties existed in the context of a much larger center-left opposition bloc. However, that's not the case anymore, and as a result, conservative voters know that when they vote for Magyar, he will actually act on conservative ideology, rather than maybe getting some small conservative concessions out of an otherwise center-left government. Therefore, conservative voters can feel safe that, no matter who they vote for, they will be getting a conservative government. As a result, Orbán's gerrymandered map is really going to become irrelevant here and may actually wind up working against him. The third reason why Orbán might still fumble despite these facts are the diaspora Hungarians. Orbán has angered diaspora Hungarians. Orbán likes to view himself as, sort of the chief of the European far right and the godfather of all of these far right parties elsewhere in Europe. But the problem with trying to build an international far right group is that everyone thinks that their ethnic group is the master race. Orbán has chummed up with leaders such as Robert Fico in Slovakia and George Simion in Romania, both of whom have antagonistic views of and relationships with the Hungarian minorities in their countries. This came to a head in 2025 when, during the Romanian presidential election, Viktor Orbán endorsed George Simion, who is the far-right political candidate. Orbán and Simion have been allies for a very long time, and Orbán encouraged ethnic Hungarians living in Romania, as well as the Romanian public at large, to vote for him. The problem with this is that George Simion has a pretty antagonistic relationship with ethnic Hungarians in Hungary. He has led far-right Romanian ethnic nationalist mobs to desecrate Hungarian cities and Hungarian holy places. This is not lost on the Hungarian population of Romania, who were quite upset with Viktor Orbán for endorsing George Simion, who, they perceive as someone who poses a fundamentally existential threat to their current lifestyle in Romania. And as a consequence, many may consider voting against him. And this is something that is not lost on Peter Magyar and something that he has certainly been taking advantage of. Magyar recently did the Million Steps walk to Romania, where he walked from Hungary all the way into Romania's interior to the area known as Székelyland, where most ethnic Hungarians within Romania currently live. He then met with local community leaders and campaigned in the area actively for their votes, something which other opposition parties weren't really able to do. So these three steps, the fact that Orbán has not faced a united opposition, the fact that the coalitions are fundamentally shifting and many conservatives are considering shifting over to Magyar, and the fact that diaspora Hungarians are turning against him may wind up either nullifying or in some cases actively reversing Orbán's institutional blocks to an opposition victory. Overall, in this election, I am predicting a Tisza party majority government with Peter Magyar as prime minister, with probably no more than 110 seats in parliament. So a Tisza majority, but not a supermajority. Fidesz will obviously come in second with a large number of votes, probably, certainly more than 80, probably more than 85, maybe somewhere around 90, and it will be a toss-up as to whether or not the Our Homeland movement and the Democratic Coalition make it into parliament. I believe that the Our Homeland movement will come in third with 5 seats, if it gains any, and then the Democratic Coalition will come in fourth with about the same, about 5 seats, once again, if it gains any at all. And so all of this brings us to the last part of the piece, which is about how this election could potentially affect Hungary's role on the world stage and its international affairs and its relations with other countries. Obviously, Orbán and Magyar have very, very different styles of policy for foreign affairs and proposed policy for foreign affairs, so there is going to be quite a difference depending on the outcome of this election, and we could really see a radical shift in Hungary's role not just within Europe, but within the world stage as a result of this election. So, first, we are going to see Hungary's role within the European Union significantly change and morph. Orbán has frequently used his position as a head of state to hold up EU processes and voting procedures in order to extort demands out of Europe. He has used this power 21 times since coming to power in 2026 in votes from member states that require unanimous consent of the leaders of those member states, most recently in 2026 when he vetoed a European-wide loan to Ukraine. Orbán often does this to extract concessions out of the European Union. The most recent veto was about the fact that Orbán wanted to allow for the reinstatement of Russian energy and gas flows to Hungary through Ukraine and wanted to negotiate language that would allow that to happen. However, of course, he was unable to do that, and as a result, he vetoed the bill. And his hope is that in the next introduction of this policy, there will be some language that allows him to continue to import Russian oil and gas, which will give him the exception that he needs. Orban also has done this before with regards to other European Union funding procedures, such as mandating that the European Union drops its requirements that member states follow rule of law and democracy guidelines to receive certain kinds of aid in order to hold up a EU-wide budget proposal. So while this is sometimes transactional, sometimes Orban also just does this for ideological reasons. Orban vetoed an attempt for a European-wide minimum corporate tax. He has vetoed an attempt to impose sanctions on Russian oligarchs, and also vetoed an attempt to impose sanctions on Israeli settlers. So sometimes he is doing it to extract concessions, sometimes he is just doing it because that is what he ideologically believes. But in either case, a lot of these votes are basically 26-1, with the one being Hungary holding up the entire process, and so this has made Orban very, very unpopular within Europe. A lot of European leaders have straight up said that what Viktor Orban is doing, especially with regards to Ukraine aid, is unacceptable. Some commentators have even called him a traitor for doing so in the context of the broader European Union-Russian confrontation. And as a result, he's become very, very unpopular with other European leaders and other European countries. If Magyar comes to power, he is likely to stop vetoing some of these measures. The European Union would be much more open to introducing or reintroducing proposals that were dropped due to Orban's liberal use of his veto power, and the current EU administration will definitely try to test some of these policies against Magyar's approval to see if they can actually get some meaningful accomplishments passed, especially as it relates to Ukraine aid. And while there are other sort of sticklers who are willing to hold up EU processes, like Robert Fico, who is the populist prime minister of Slovakia, who I'm sure I will have to talk about when Slovakia's election rolls around, they all have been far more pragmatic than Orban in these kinds of negotiations. And a lot of these vetoes were, as I mentioned, basically 26-1, with Orban being the one outlier. So Orban has really been holding things up, and Orban no longer being there could create the conditions for actual progress, especially on Ukraine aid. I don't think Magyar would be all in on everything that the EU does. He is trying to portray himself as a moderate, especially compared to the previous very liberal pro-European opposition, and as a result, he kind of wants to stand in between the, very, very pro-EU policies of previous opposition parties and Orban's hard Euroscepticism. So we will probably see him accept some things, particularly as it relates to, approving aid for Ukraine, not holding up budgets until he gets what he wants, gradually developing energy independence from Russia over a longer amount of time. But he probably isn't likely to approve everything. He probably won't approve of Ukraine entering the European Union. That's something that he's still officially against. And there are probably some other things that he could wind up holding up. So there is a line here as to what Magyar is willing to approve and not approve, especially since he's trying to portray himself as a happy middle between, hard Euroscepticism and complete European support. So there is sort of a line here, but right now we really don't know where that line is. And it will be up to the European Commission to sort of test that and figure out where Magyar's boundaries are. This segues into another way in which Magyar's foreign policy will be different from Orban's, and that is in Hungary's relationship with Russia. Magyar will likely seek to move Hungary closer to Ukraine and away from Russia, and undo a lot of the diplomatic damage that has occurred between Ukraine and Hungary as a result of Orban's pro-Russian stance. The friendly visits to Moscow and chummy photo ops with Putin will definitely come to a stop under Magyar, and I do imagine that Hungary will be far more careful towards allowing Russian citizens into the country and sanctioning Russian oligarchs, which is something that has been a very big point of contention with Hungary and the rest of the European Union. We may see sanctions slapped back on, Belarusian and Georgian oligarchs as well, who are allies of the Russian government, and we will probably see Magyar extend a more generous attitude towards Ukrainian refugees, which Orban has placed some restrictions on. Orban recently introduced some new regulations that would essentially say that only refugees from the eastern parts of Ukraine where there's active conflict will be recognized as refugees, and refugees from western Ukraine, which is still under bombardment, would not really be recognized as refugees. So he's placed some restrictions on that. We would probably see Magyar lift some of those. We would also probably see Magyar, lift sort of Orban's antagonism over the treatment of Hungarians in Ukraine. Orban has been making this really, really big push and this really, really big stink lately over alleged mistreatment of Hungarians in Ukraine, which, to be clear, is just utter nonsense and something that Orban has clearly made up, and we will likely see Magyar sort of drop this needless antagonism with Ukraine over that issue. We will also likely probably see Hungary lift some of the bans that it has placed on Ukrainian news outlets, which have been critical of the Hungarian government, which have been in place under Orban. Magyar would probably lift those. And we may even see Hungary give some military aid to Ukraine, or at least some humanitarian aid. These are things that Orban has placed heavy restrictions on and has not allowed to actually go to Ukraine. He has a very strict policy of zero aid to Ukraine, and we will probably see that lifted under Magyar. It's unclear how much exactly he is willing to give to Ukraine. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see all these immediate weapon sales. Not just because Hungary isn't that much of a weapons exporter, but also just because, Magyar has to toe this sort of middle line between pro-Europeanism and Euroscepticism, and the Overton window in Hungary has moved so far to the right that, providing direct military aid might be a little bit over the line, but I can at least see some humanitarian aid and economic aid concessions being made to Zelensky from Magyar. But we will see once again how that goes. Nobody really knows exactly where Magyar's line is. He's very clearly trying to win over a bunch of, former Fidesz voters. So we will have to see what he thinks he can get away with in terms of that. It will also be interesting to see how Hungary's relations with Turkey evolve under Magyar versus under Orban. Especially with his close friendship with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Hungary and Turkey have grown much closer together. Hungary has joined the Organization of Turkic States, which is a regional bloc that Turkey is trying to build up. And in exchange, Hungary has also been very, very supportive of Turkey's bid to join the European Union and has accused other EU member states of sort of holding up Turkey's EU bid and sort of disingenuously negotiating with Turkey in such a way that Turkey was being strung along, believing that it could become a member of the EU, when in reality, no member of the EU actually wants it. So Orban has been very accusatory towards the rest of the EU about that. He has been very pro-Turkey and pro-Turkey acceding to the European Union, and he has also grown economic ties with Turkey. If Magyar was to come to power, we would probably see a lot less of this. I think Magyar, as a means of, getting on the European Union's good side again, would probably drop this antagonism, which is very, very unpopular among the rest of the EU and, the rest of the EU's voters and with the rest of the EU's heads of state. So I do think that Magyar would sort of move away from this very pro-Turkish position, especially because, Orban is an autocratic oligarch. Erdogan is an autocratic oligarch. The two men are friends. And, Magyar, as a dissident in the Hungarian context, probably wouldn't care that much for, another oligarchic autocrat that is friends with the oligarchic autocrat that he just helped, vote out of office. So as a consequence, I can probably see Magyar moving away from Turkey a little bit. I can see relations between Hungary and Turkey cooling down a little bit under Magyar. Once again, he hasn't said much on this, but just by nature of the fact that Orban is going to be gone and Orban and Erdogan had a very special relationship, I can kind of see Turkish-Hungarian relations cooling down a little bit. Another open question is how exactly pro or anti-Israel Magyar will turn out to be. So Orban, of course, has been very staunchly pro-Israel. Orban, as a consequence of being part of the global far right, is a very big fan of Netanyahu's far-right government in Israel. He has staunchly supported Netanyahu's war on Gaza. He has staunchly supported arming Netanyahu, despite the, mounting evidence that he has committed horrendous war crimes in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And Orban has, as a result, blocked sanctions on Israeli far-right politicians and settlers as a member of the European Union. So he has been holding up a lot of those sanctions, which have been backed by, surprisingly, a lot of other EU member states, including a lot of conservatives that you wouldn't really expect to be behind that push. So this has also made Viktor Orban very unpopular within the European Union, and he, on this issue, is very clearly out of step with Europe's broader opinion, which is that there should be sanctions on these Israeli far-right leaders and these Israeli settlements, and that, the European Union should be making steps to ensure that Israel is not committing these war crimes, which it very obviously is. And like I said, a lot of leaders that you would not expect to get behind that. A lot of center-right conservative leaders have gotten on board with this issue. And, that's why it's only Hungary vetoing some of these pushes to, sanction far-right settlers and politicians. But we know, of course, what Orban will do. The question is what Magyar will do. So Magyar, I could see him going either way on this issue, honestly. Once again, Magyar is kind of trying to toe a line between, total agreement with the EU and total disagreement with the EU. So this could be an issue on which he chooses to, give a little bit of slack to his sort of, maybe more anti-EU constituents who would be voting for him instead of Fidesz for the first time and, vote against these sanctions on Israel, as well as the fact that he is a conservative, and conservatives in the European Union have been very historically pro-Israel. So he may decide to actually continue to hold that line. However, Magyar is, of course, trying to get back on the European Union's good side. One of Magyar's key foreign policy objectives has been to receive back a bunch of aid that has been withheld from Hungary by the European Union for reasons of, abuse of the rule of law and undermining of democracy. And as a consequence, to get back on their good side, he might just go with them on this issue, especially on one that there seems to be, a pretty strong consensus on among European leaders, even those that you wouldn't expect to be behind this. And, once again, I don't think that Peter Magyar will be a, super warrior for Palestine. Many of these European leaders aren't. It's just that Orban has been holding up some very common sense measures related to, sanctioning far-right Israeli settlers and politicians that I think that Magyar may or may not drop his opposition to. I don't think that, Peter Magyar is going to be, an anti-Zionist warrior or anything. I just think that he may allow these, small sort of common sense deterrence measures that are kind of more optical than anything else to pass such that he can regain favor with the rest of the European Union, because they have, of course, wanted these, very small common sense steps for a very long time. The last thing I want to talk about that would change with Hungary's foreign affairs under Magyar versus under Orban is sort of the cultural significance of Hungary and the cultural capital that it has lent far-right leaders and conservatives in other countries, and how that would kind of disappear. So Orban, of course, has positioned himself as the godfather of the European far-right. He enjoys very, very close relations with other far-right leaders across Europe. He enjoys very close relations with the AfD in Germany, with the National Rally in France, with the PVV in the Netherlands, with Vox in Spain, with Reform UK, and, of course, with the Republican Party in the United States. And a lot of these political parties have openly admitted that they seek to copy Orban's Hungary on a number of foreign policy issues, particularly immigration, but also on things such as media and the rule of law as well, which is, disturbing to some people, but nonetheless, Orban sort of serves as a template for their governance. Now, while Hungary under Orban doesn't provide any direct material support to these groups, it doesn't, pay them any money. Of course, it would be illegal for Hungary to do that, but Hungary does kind of lend credence to these groups, and it sort of gives them a model of governance under Orban which they can look to. Orban has hosted and, used government resources to accommodate large conservative gatherings such as CPAC. He sort of serves as a cultural lighthouse for the far right. And of course, he also has a number of state media outlets under his control which broadcast far-right propaganda. Most of them are in Hungarian, so it doesn't really totally matter, but, some of them are in English, and they are spreading far-right talking points, so there is also that fact, that kind of moral support that is provided by, the way state media covers elections and leaders in other countries. I think that's definitely a potential effect. And overall, I think that we are going to see the far-right across Europe and across the world have to do a lot of soul searching if Orban loses. This is the guy that is meant to represent their ideal society. And if it is possible for him to lose, well, who really knows what's next for these parties? They lose their model of governance, the person who they have looked up to for, more than a decade and a half at this point. And to be clear, I don't think that, all of these far-right parties will collapse overnight if Orban goes. Obviously, a lot of these far-right parties have, strong far-right support among their populations. I mean, look at Reform UK, they're surging. They're going to win a majority government if an election was held today. The AfD and National Rally are first in the polls in the French and German political systems. So I don't think that these parties are going to just unravel because Orban is gone, but I do think they're going to have to rethink their model of governance a little bit, especially if it is possible for Orban to lose in a system that he specifically designed not to lose. And they're going to have to, sort of grapple with the fact that their ideological product is in fact fallible and, can fail. So I think this is really more about kind of the psychological damage that this will do to the far right by losing their, greatest stronghold than any actual material effect, it's like I said, it's not like Orban has been directly paying these parties, and in a lot of cases they enjoy, very, very significant domestic support wherever they may be. I just think that they're going to have to, maybe rethink a bit of their strategy once they gain power. As a final closing thought, I want to raise the following possibility that everyone in Hungary, in Europe, and in the world is kind of, thinking about in the back of their mind with regards to this election. And that possibility is that Viktor Orban simply ignores the results of this election if he loses. Orban has shown that he is willing to bend and break the rules of democracy to suit his own interests, and is willing to bend the electoral environment, the media environment, and the electoral rules themselves in order to benefit himself. He openly shirks the idea of liberal democracy and is trying to build a self-described illiberal state. And so, as a result, maybe it's not so far-fetched to think that if he loses, he might be willing to ignore the results. This situation actually brings me back to October of 2024, when I had this entire article written about the election that was coming up in the country of Georgia in the Caucasus. I had written an entire article about the electoral dynamics in Georgia, who was winning, who was losing, and who might, actually wind up becoming the prime minister, and at what percentages each party might come in at. All of it, however, immediately went out the window when it became clear that the government had initiated a systemic vote-rigging operation, gave themselves an illegal supermajority, and then banned all opposition parties. Of course, this made me look, pretty stupid for even bothering to actually write an article about this, since, of course, the government never planned on letting the election play out in a free and fair manner anyway. But Georgia was in a very similar situation to the situation that Hungary is in right now. The oligarchic leadership of the country have come up with, fake pollsters, fraudulent opposition parties, ever-shifting electoral systems, and collaborated with media oligarchs in order to create as favorable an environment as possible and to openly stuff ballot boxes for the ruling Georgian Dream Party that now rules the country under Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze. Now, this would be much larger of a risk for Orban than in Georgia, right? Hungary is a NATO and an EU member, and of course Georgia is neither of those, and as a result, Hungary has a lot more to lose from openly rigging an election than Georgia does. But we are in an eerily similar moment, I think. A lot of the techniques that the Georgian Dream used to fraudulently win that election remind me of a lot of what Orban is doing now in the run-up to his election. Therefore, I ask you not to ignore the possibility that Orban genuinely does go off the deep end, crosses the final Rubicon, and openly rigs the Hungarian election and jails Magyar and other opponents. If you live in Hungary or Europe or even the United States, I urge you to watch this election carefully. Be vigilant, follow the news, and in particular opposition reporting on the conduct of the vote on election day. Orban isn't really a Hungarian problem. He exercises so much sway over global far-right politics in their sort of global zeitgeist that Hungary's problems are now kind of officially all of our problems, right? Orban is laying down the template for what a lot of these far-right political parties want to do once they gain power. And if he rigs this election and gets away with it, it could show the global far-right that that is something that can be done and might encourage the global far-right to get a lot more bold as well. All the best to anyone watching from Hungary and the Hungarian people as they move into this election, and of course I wish them a safe and secure transition of power, and as always, may the most popular politician win. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching my second ever electoral primer to give you some context behind some of the important elections that are coming up around the world. If you think I did a good job, feel free to leave a like. If you want to see more from me and you want to help me keep growing this channel and keep doing this, a subscribe would also be very much appreciated. I'm very grateful for any engagement that I can get through likes and subscribes, or if you think I left something out, feel free to leave a comment telling me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you on the next episode of Electionism.